Spyderco Sage 2 quickie review. So, first up, geometry. Behind the bevel here, it's 0.6 millimeters. Behind the point, it's 0.7 millimeters. At the spine, we're at about 2.96 millimeters. And this gives this knife quite good geometry for a production knife. Obviously, it's a flat ground blade, double distal taper, so it performs well. Again, as with durability, you're not looking at a knife designed for prying or something like that, but cutting performance is good. Just to compare quickly to, say, the Paramilitary 2, we're looking at, for that blade, 0.75 millimeters, both behind the bevel and at the point. Spine is 3.67 millimeters. And so this gives this slightly better geometry than the Para 2. Again, it's a good slicer. It's obviously designed for detail work, as it's got a relatively small blade. There are two grips available. The first is like here, which is basically a 3-finger grip. Some people might complain that this is uncomfortable, the way this protrudes into your index finger. However, if you notice what happens when you apply force to the blade here, you're actually countering that with your thumb, and then holding it, you're creating torque, and you're holding it with these fingers. So your index finger doesn't actually, in this grip, doesn't actually serve to press upward on the blade, or excuse me, on the handle. It instead is used for rotation control, and in that case, it is actually not an issue. If you just feel like holding it like this and gripping it as tight as you can, in that case it's not highly comfortable, and you're also stressing. You can feel if you do that, you can feel the lock bar moving. Not necessarily even outward, you may be moving it downward slightly. But clearly the knife was designed for this grip, and if you see the mechanics of that, it is quite comfortable on your middle finger because of the way it wraps around. The knuckle goes right into that, and so it doesn't create a hot spot despite being quite narrow. But you can see you're gripping it all the way around with your other fingers, but you're only gripping it really with the tips of your fingers up here on the blade, and as a result you can see that the design was clearly intended for detail cutting, where you're putting precision behind the edge and the point. So you have a lot of ability here when you grip the knife like this to rotate it in a controlled manner, which benefits you when you're trying to cut fine details. It should also at this point be noted that the clips ergonomics are quite good. I do find Spyderco's wire clips to be something they should be commended for. They claim it's expensive to make, or more expensive at least than their hourglass clips. I'm not entirely sure how expensive a small stamped, bent, I guess it's a forming machine, a forming process, probably bent flat, and then this curve here that makes it into a three-dimensional shape is the final step. But I'm guessing that it couldn't be that expensive, and they should probably apply it to more of their knives. It certainly is one of my favorites. It also is thicker at about 1.6 millimeters thick, this steel rod stock that is made from. That makes it about, I don't know, I think I should have the numbers in front of me. I'm afraid I don't. It makes it about 0.3 millimeters, I believe, thicker off the top of my head than the standard Golden Colorado hourglass style clip. And it's obviously fully radiused, which again makes it more comfortable. Now, should an hourglass clip like this be fully radiused and be slightly thicker, that would obviously provide superior comfort because you have only pressure points at the edges rather than in the center. But I guess that's not the way it's done, which is not to say that normal Spyderco clips are hideously uncomfortable. There are certainly ones which are much more uncomfortable, but it is something to note. Clips don't have to necessarily be that uncomfortable. Obviously, also clips in the tip up for right-handed users, tip up right hand carry position, are more comfortable than any other position, because down here at the palm of your hand, you're creating sort of a hollow as you grip, and so you have less interference than if you were to put it on this side or up here, where it could potentially interfere with your index finger as you grip it. So that's a good point. Overall, we're just over 10. I think I measured it at 10.05 millimeters thick at one spot. And this gets us into the lock bar. So people say that frame locks are inherently stronger. I disagree with this, because they say, well, look at how thick that lock bar is. Well, yes, the lock bar itself is, in this case, 2.97 millimeters thick right here, which is obviously relatively strong. But the lock bars don't usually fail here. They fail here at the spring section, because in this spring section, it's only 1.29 millimeters thick for a good distance, and so this really doesn't make it any stronger than a captured liner lock. And if anything, it makes it weaker than a captured liner lock, because if this starts to fail outward, right, the force will be directed back this way and then come out here, and so this will just bow and fail in that direction. And a captured liner lock, A, doesn't endure any downward forces like this, because you're gripping presumably the scales to either side of it, and B, if it does start to fail outward, it has something bracing it, the composite that makes up the handle, whereas this does not. That's not to say that I expect this lock to fail prematurely or anything like that. I simply don't necessarily hold to the argument that frame locks are inherently a superior locking mechanism, or Reeve integral locks, as Spyderco prefers to call them. In this case, the lock face here was carbidized. When it was taken apart, it was noted that very little contact, maybe just a few square millimeters, just the top corner of the blade tang was actually what was interfacing with the lock face, and as a result, this lock will wear more rapidly than one that has full contact. It's at about 40% right now, 40% across the blade tang. It was not sticky from the factory, or not particularly sticky from the factory. Carbidizing and lubricating with a dry film lubricant improved this. The other thing to note is that this knife is essentially press fit together. So these screws, the whole thing has its alignment justified prior to putting in the screws. So it is actually pretty precisely made. You can't, unlike with other knives, you essentially have slot built into the system and then can shift it either way before torquing it down with the screws. This knife is justified before it's screwed together. As a result, you can see it is centered, both closed and, it's harder to see on camera, but closed and open, which speaks to its quality, and the Tai Chung factory is good. The one thing I was disappointed in was that it came relatively gritty. I was surprised. The Tai Chung models normally come better than this. This one did not come great. Took it apart, cleaned it out, and it was lubricated with what looked like a petroleum product. And obviously this is not ideal for a knife. Petroleum products do attract dirt and grit, and folders inherently work in gritty, dirty environments. Your pocket is not particularly clean, and so it was re-lubricated with a dry film lubricant, which is what I prefer, which doesn't attract anything, and reassembled, and now it is much smoother. It's not fall-free smooth, although that has to do with how tight I have the pivot tension. That could be opened up a bit and improve its movement. But that said, it's not what you'd call a slouch. So you can flick it like that, you can flick it like this, and of course you can flick it like that. So it is still plenty smooth. Again, this can be backed out slightly to improve this. It's a very precisely done knife in here, which is very good. What else can we note? Let's control. So from the factory, the hole on this came a little too sharp, at least for my preferences. And also Spyderco generally has a relatively low finish inside these holes. So as a result, I'd actually discovered years ago that when opening the knife like this, you slide the hole around the tip of your ring finger, and you can actually cut yourself this way. And I was discovering I was repeatedly cutting myself this way. For the longest time, I was baffled as to what I was actually doing to cut myself like this, because I wouldn't notice that I was cut until I touched something acidic or something like that, and it would burn. So the solution was simply to go in here, and not only was the corner slightly rounded, the inside of this area was polished, because on a Spyderco, this is actually, in my experience, the most likely place to find corrosion, because every time you open it, if your hands are sweating, you're rubbing a little salty sweat into that hole, and being relatively lower surface finish than most of the blade, you're creating an area which you rarely touch, so you rarely wipe away any corrosion, or starting corrosion, and you have low finish, which promotes corrosion. So this surface finish was improved in here, and then it was treated to resist rust, and as a result, that should significantly improve it. Yes. So, treating it. So the dry film lubricant that was both in here and in the spider hole was my preferred Tough Glide, and that also was applied to the lock face. And so that can, even a sticky titanium lock, that can fix it in some cases, because it's relatively high load bearing, molybdenum disulfide is, that is, if that sentence just made sense. And it's not, on this knife at least, so slick that you can force it closed particularly easy. I did not try spy and wax on this, but the finish of the tang is relatively rough, so certainly until it wears in, that probably won't become an issue. It's also important to note that this does not have the safety type of lockup on the tang. I don't know how visible this is, but there are two types of tang faces which can be cut. There's the type that Strider calls their new lockup face, which is just a straight flat grind across, which is the non-safety type, which is what this has. And then there is the safety type, where it's actually ground on a round grinder, and so at the edge it's flat and it increases in angle as it goes across. And what the safety type does is it assures, so if you were to close this until force drove this outward, a straight across one would continue driving this to the side until it slips off and the blade closes and the lock fails. The safety type has that little flat there, so it will drive off of the angled part of the tang until it gets to the flat, at which point it stops because it's no longer really applying lateral force, because there is no more angle. So that is at least my preference of how one of these locks should be designed. Now, people who like super early lockup don't prefer this because they like their knife to look pretty in here, and so if you have a constant angle going all the way across, it's much easier to maintain early lockup for longer than it is on one of the safety types of lockups. I do think it's sacrificing functionality for aesthetics, particularly on something like the new Striders, but I guess that's their prerogative. So the one difference from the other members of the Sage series that should be noted here before we move on is right in here, this. So the Sage 1 and the Sage 2 because their liner and frame locks respectively have a cutout here to disengage the lock. Now, in the Stage 3, which is the bolt action lock, and the Stage 4, which is the lockback, they don't require any cutout here, so they actually don't have this. So my comments on the comfortability of the knife in this grip are not actually pertinent to those knives. Presumably, it wouldn't create an issue, but that remains to be seen. This angle certainly makes it comfortable to have your finger at that sort of, your middle finger at that sort of angle there. So I can't speak for those knives. So the one other thing that's now said about this knife that I'd like to finish up on, sort of a little relevant discussion, is many people call this knife the poor man's CRK, the poor man's Spyderco. And I don't actually hold to that. And the reason I don't hold to that, sort of broadly, is that they're completely different knives from completely different companies. So we can look at this. The Spyderco, it has, unless you, I think it's an extra option, unless you pay for a dual thumb stud, you get a non-ambidextrous knife, which I suppose isn't the worst thing in the world, considering that the lock isn't ambidextrous on all of them. But just say you were to need your other hand, it is convenient to be able to open the knife either way. Well, you could argue you could open it this way. Again, different knives. There's the hardness. So Spyderco runs S30V, CRK now runs S35VN, but Spyderco runs theirs harder, broadly. CRK runs their blades relatively soft. I think they advertise 58 Rockwell or something like that, which for a relatively small pocket knife seems absurdly soft. I'm sure they have their reasons, and I'm sure they have their data to back up why their position is correct, but I think they say something to the effect of, well, this makes sense from a use perspective because it gives the user additional toughness, and the additional hardness isn't necessary, it makes sharpening more difficult, so on and so forth. But you have to ask yourself at some point in time, how much, how average a user is going to purchase, what, a roughly $400 brand new knife, depending on model size, specification, etc. Somebody who can afford that surely is not, it's not going to be beyond their means to get a few $20 diamond hones that can be used to sharpen this, let alone just a little bit of lapping paste that you can just apply to a strop and strop these carbide steels up to a nice level of finish. So I'm not sure from a user sharpening perspective that's really worthwhile, and certainly the necessity of repeated sharpenings would negate that. Spyderco's harder. They run their blades, I haven't obviously had this one Rockwell tested, but they run their blades over 60 Rockwell, which is part of the reason why they have such a reputation for their edge retention cutting ability, which is, I think, a very worthwhile thing. So there's that. What else do we have next? Geometry. Spyderco, full flat grind. CRK, they do a hollow grind. Now, from an initial cutting perspective, your first cut out of the box, I guess you could say, the flat grind would have geometry advantages because you only reach maximum thickness back here, right? Whereas the CRK, you have the edge of the hollow somewhere up here creating a pressure point. So, and a steeper effective angle. So if you're cutting a rigid material that is taller than the height of the blade, you're at a disadvantage. But as you move back with progressive sharpening, CRK actually puts the thin point of their hollow grind, the thinnest point on their knife, back from the actual edge. So you have several sharpenings in there before you start thickening the edge bevel. In fact, as you start to sharpen your CRK, the edge bevel actually gets thinner initially and then gets thicker as you finally move up the bevel. The Spyderco, however, gets thicker from the first sharpening. Every additional sharpening, you gain a little bit of thickness there. So that's something else to consider. The design. I think this is really the first major half of where these two models stand apart. People look at them, they say, well, they're bead blasted, reeve integral lock, folding knives in something like S30V, a high performance steel, and they're designed for everyday pocket carry, and they're about the same length, again, depending on model. Yes, all that is true, but the ergonomics are radically different, and the designs are radically different. The CRK is sort of a very postmodern minimalist design. You have straight handles, you have a single choil, and you have no choil for choking up on the blade. This puts you at a disadvantage when trying to do detail cutting, because you can't really get up there on the blade and get close to the tip, because obviously the closer to the tip you are, the better your ability is to control the blade. And also you have less ergonomics in the rest of the handle. It's not as comfortable a knife. It's just not as well designed in that respect. But it has much more artistic flair, certainly, if that sort of modern minimalist is your thing. Contrast that with this, you have a very curved shape. It's not particularly attractive, at least not to my eyes, but clearly it was designed for the human hand, which is not made up of straight lines. So in this way, this knife does have an advantage. Both obviously do have beveled edges. But what you're getting here was something designed for the human hand rather than something for the human eye, and that's how I put that. So really, your only real points of comparison are size and locking mechanism, which really doesn't make the two competitive models in that sense. Certainly, price-wise and brand-wise, they're completely different. And this gets into the other thing, brand. So many people say, well, you know, this is the poor man's Spyderco. Well, why would this then be the poor man's Spyderco? If a poor man were poor, why wouldn't he buy a far cheaper knife that could cut things? I mean, that's really about the limit of it. You could buy a $15 China-made knife, and that would be the poor man's alternative, would it not? So, you know, you're paying, when you buy a CRK, you're paying for a certain amount of pomp and circumstance. You're paying for a certain amount of warranty. CRK, for example, unlike Spyderco, this is one of my only real beefs with Spyderco, is that they don't let you disassemble the knives. I would simply state a warranty is there's a fees for reassembling knife, and the warranty doesn't cover damage caused by disassembly. But Spyderco goes one further and says, well, if you disassemble a knife, you void the warranty. Well, I could understand why you'd say that could be true of something on the level of complexity as a car, but a knife, something which has maybe two moving parts, it's really not comparable. And likewise, maintenance is required, and unless Spyderco were interested in providing this maintenance for everyone, which they're not, disassembly is actually necessary to maintain the knife. Things will get in the pivot. The pivot will need lubrication. The knife will require maintenance. So while I could certainly understand them not covering modification, certainly disassembly is an integral part of folding knife ownership. CRK recognizes this, and they actually provide the disassembly tool with their knives, which is definitely worth something. Knowing that your knife, you will be able to service your knife without voiding the warranty is something that's worthwhile. Obviously, modifying this knife in addition to disassembling it has thoroughly voided the warranty. There's no claims that it could not possibly have been disassembled. But there you have it. So that's really my review of these knives, or this knife. Should you buy this? If you like the really clean looking, thin slicer knives, yes, I think the Sage series is a great test platform, and that is sort of a very neutral design. It doesn't have anything that jumps out at you, but it doesn't have anything that's really particularly objectionable either. You have your choice of locking mechanism, and you have sort of the Spyderco signature full flat ground leaf-shaped blade in a thin enough platform that it can cut anything, but not so delicate that you couldn't use it as an everyday knife. The frame lock is not my favorite of these, of the Sage series. Certainly wouldn't have been my choice, but this isn't my knife. It is quite a good knife. I think of all the Sage series, the bolt action lock appeals to me the most, but I don't own one of those either. And it is a great knife. So it will be noted that users fret a great deal about overextending this locking mechanism, and while it is possible, the whole knife really wasn't built to the level of durability where you'd be using it in an extreme use situation. So the idea that, well, you'd be wearing something like heavy gloves, not paying attention, under duress, and you'd overextend this lock bar, the amount of force that would be required to do that is not insignificant. And I think that users who fear that, who fret about that on a knife such as this, are misplacing their priorities. But yes, other than that, specs are on Spyderco's website. There's no need to rehash them. Clip is reversible. Good clean design. Lightweight knife too, given its construction, obviously. That's it. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe. And if you liked this video, there's another user, Cliff Stamp, whose reviews I don't always agree with his opinions. I don't think he always agrees with mine. But you should check out his YouTube channel. I'll probably link it in the description. He knows a fair bit more about knives than I do, and his opinions are certainly worth seeing. I think it's really good, actually, that he's no longer on Blade forums, because the politics have been taken out of this. I'm sorry, Cliff, if you're watching and I'm saying things about you don't like, but I think it's great that he's no longer on Blade forums, in that it sort of freed him from the politics and the constant attacking, so he can review things and be completely shed of all these accusations of bias or opinion. And he comes up with really good conclusions. I don't assign the level of intent to manufacturers that he does in some cases, but minor differences of opinion. But yeah, thanks for watching. Bye, guys.